Hey, Quinn here for Pyramind. In just a minute, I'm going to give you my first impressions of the brand new Kiive audio plugin, the NFuse Master Bus Processor. It's a great sounding plugin with a unique twist, and I think you'll be just as excited as I am about it. But before I get into it, I just want to remind everybody to subscribe to Pyramind if you like these videos. And if you want to dive deeper into our music production program, you can hit that join button down below me. Channel members get access to class videos taken directly from our school curriculum. It's practically like being a Pyramind student, you just don't get to see my face every day. Members also get early access to videos like this, and our vault of elite session guest lectures. If you do want to see my face every day, and learn to produce with the guidance of our instructors, always enrolling for our in-studio classes here in San Francisco. And if you're not here in the Bay Area, you can join our classes live from wherever you are, with our new hybrid program. Thanks for checking us out, and now let's take a look at NFuse by Kiive Audio. This is the NFuse, and they told me it's their most ambitious plugin yet, and I can see why, because it's an emulation of two different master bus processors in one plugin. The Neve Master Bus Transformer, and also the Solid State Logic Fusion. These are both the current flagship all-in-one mastering hardware units available from both of these companies respectively. And the NFuse plugin not only emulates both of them, but you can actually switch between the individual modules of each type. So you can craft your ideal master chain that way. So to be fully transparent, I'm working with a beta version of the plugin that Kiive Audio sent us for free. But this video is going to be all my personal feelings about the plugin. And I even have a couple of suggestions for them after using it for about a day. I'll give you all a quick overview of the plugin's features. Then I'll talk you through 3 different master chain setups that I have made with it. One each using only the Neve and SSL models, and a third with a hybrid of both. By the way, I'm using a mixdown of my track 510 Flyin' for all the examples today. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the plugin interface. I switched everything over to the SSL side to start with, and we're just going to talk about each of these modules individually. Input and output section has input gain, of course. We've got our high-pass filter on the input. I'm going to turn that up just a bit. I usually go maybe like 21 hertz or something with that, just to kind of get rid of the lowest end rumble that we might not necessarily need in the master. We'll start with the saturation circuit over here. And I find this saturation circuit on the SSL side to be real crunchy. As I turn this up during this intro section, and these tones start to come in, you'll notice we've got a lot of kind of grit, a lot of kind of crunch to this, especially at maximum. And our density knob is going to control sort of the type of harmonics that are emphasized. Over at minimum, it's mostly kind of even harmonics, and I think over at maximum, it's a little bit more odd harmonics, actually. And I'm going to turn this drive down so you can kind of hear just how much that was actually doing, right? Turn that back up to something a little bit more reasonable, maybe like almost like 2. We can actually hear that really kind of smacks it. I'll turn that density down to minimum. And I'll turn our saturation down to minimum. So I do find that the saturation circuit on the SSL section specifically is almost a little too crunchy for the type of mastering and sort of the type of music that I especially make, where a lot of things are already kind of like gritty and distorted. It might sound really, really awesome if you're creating more sort of like vintage sounding style masters for maybe like rock or like soul or R&B or types of music like that. But for this type of music, a little bit too much, I noticed. We'll move over to the equalizer section. We have 2 equalizer bands. We have a low frequency and a high frequency, and they are shelving filters, and you can change between 30 hertz and 90 hertz for the low shelf, and 8 kilohertz and 20 kilohertz for the high shelf over here. So I'll go ahead and set this up to maybe like 65, add a little bit of low boost. I'll just go up like 1.5 dB or so, but I'll show you what it sounds like when you get all the way up to 9. You can really kind of start slamming that, and also you'll notice that the compressor is actually activated now too, that I've slammed that up there. So I'll just boost it a little bit, maybe 2 dB. Same thing for the high filter. Bring that up a little bit more, maybe like 2.5, 2.25. Let's go ahead and sweep this. So down all the way at 8 kilohertz, we can really listen to mostly just the kind of mids or high mids to upper highs. And then up here at 20 kilohertz, you just are barely getting any kind of high frequency boost. So I'd like to put this somewhere around maybe between 12K and maybe like 9K. Probably like 9.5. And add just a little bit. That'll just give you that extra kind of high-end kind of sparkle and kind of like air. Now, let's move over to the compressor. And this is the thing that's really the most different from the hardware. Again, this is modeled after the SSL G-Comp. It's not actually modeled after the compressor that's inside of the SSL Fusion. The compressor inside of the SSL Fusion almost seems like it's more of a, I guess, a de-esser to me, because it's a high filter compression. So it has sort of a crossover, and then it's also got kind of a compression amount, are the only two controls on there. So it kind of acts as a mastering de-esser. Let's go ahead and turn our threshold down here so we get a little bit of gain reduction. Cool. And we can switch between ratio of 2:1, 4:1, and 10:1 for some more intense compression. I'll keep it at the 2:1 for what I'm doing here. It's a little example. We've got all the way at really fast 0.1 millisecond attack times to pretty slow 20 millisecond attack time. Not the slowest attack time for a mastering compressor. And then same thing for release. We can go down to 0.1. And I think these might be measured in seconds, but I'm not sure. Let's take a look. Doesn't say, but that's okay. So we can hear we have a faster release, or we can get a slower or automatic release where it'll actually try to be program dependent and kind of detect what it needs the release to be. I find this compressor, it's kind of nice sounding. I mean, it's modeled after the G-Comp, so it's a pretty good compressor. We can add some makeup gain in here too. Get a little bit of boost out of there. Turn that down just a touch. And then a kind of hidden feature of this compressor almost is the sidechain input filter. So this is actually going to filter out things below a certain hertz from the detection circuit of the compressor. And that is going to basically make it so that the kick and the bass and the low end information is not going to trigger the compressor as much and give you a sort of like a slightly less pumpy, slightly less kind of, intense and squashed compression overall. Cool. All right, now we'll go ahead and take a look at our stereo imager over here. What's interesting about this stereo imager is you can actually turn the stereo amount down here and almost get like a mono signal. In fact, I think that is a mono signal that we're getting right now at minimum. But as you turn it up to maximum, you actually start introducing more stereo width. You start turning up the sidebands and creating more kind of width in your master. And then we also have this space style. And from what I read, the space control basically has sort of like a effect on the EQ boost or cut of the higher or low frequencies of the sidebands specifically. So I believe if you turn the space down, we're going to make our sidebands, I think, a little bit less intense in the low frequencies. And as we turn space up, yeah, we can hear that the sidebands are more intense in the lower frequencies. So the kind of low mids in the sidebands feels like they're kind of boosted. It can be a little bit of an intense effect. So what I might do is I try to sort of turn it into minimum section. Maybe to extreme. I think it may actually turn everything down a little bit. So I'm going to do maybe a space of maybe plus 1.3 and see how that sounds. It just adds sort of like extra kind of like EQ boost on the sidebands to kind of make the width even more intense than just increasing the width. And then of course, at the end here, we have our output section, which we can turn down to -24 and up to +24, which we can hear is kind of smashing it. And by the way, the one thing that this plugin does not do is it does not actually give us a final limiter stage, as far as I can tell. So I'm actually using just a classic Pro L2 at the other end of it, just to make sure that we're not clipping, essentially. I don't even have any gain going on in this Pro L2. It's just to set us to exactly negative 0.3 dB. Cool. All right, now let's go ahead and turn all of these off. And we're going to switch over to the Neve models for everything. And we're going to listen to those. Input section, you'll notice, is basically exactly the same for the Neve model. It just is a gain control and a high-pass filter control. Now, saturation circuit, on the other hand, this is a completely different style of saturation. Instead of having a overall drive and a sort of like harmonic shift control, we actually sort of have a multiband saturation where the dark dial will saturate mostly the lows, and the red dial is going to saturate mostly the highs. So if I turn the red up as we're listening to this build up, we can make that pretty intense. Now if I turn the dark up as well, now you'll notice that as I turn both of those up to maximum, you hear how it's not quite so crunchy at all as the saturation in the SSL version. It actually is really, even with these turned up to maximum, sounds pretty pleasant. And it's just adding some sort of like extra kind of like oomph and weight to the low end mostly. Let me turn this all the way down. So we can hear that it's a lot less sort of like punchy, there's a lot less smack, and as you turn that dark up, it really adds some like weight and thickness to the bottom end. And then the red adds some really nice kind of subtle crunch and kind of like nice sizzle to the sort of like high end, especially on these hi-hats and cymbals that we're listening to here. I'm gonna turn both of them up maybe about 50%. So there's a nice kind of balance. We also have this ZNR drive. What that is it sort of switches the circuit to more of a diode style distortion or saturation. So it's kind of like a diode style hard clipper or soft clipper actually going on. So it's going to, as we drive these saturators, theoretically add a little bit more crunch. But I've noticed that unless we really sort of turn the input up a bunch, I find that it's really not super easy to truly make this saturation circuit sound crunchy and extreme and way too over distorted and over intense. So it's actually a really awesome saturation circuit. This one I definitely prefer to the SSL version. Sorry to SSL. And good on Kiive Audio for modeling this really well. Now, moving on to the equalizer. Again, we have a 2-band shelving EQ. The low goes between 30 and 240 hertz, so you can actually boost way more into the kind of upper mids. I'm gonna start turning that up so we can actually kind of get even more kind of low end thump and punch going on in here. Obviously this is a little extreme, so I might turn that down. But we can go up to something like maybe 110 hertz or something with this, which I think is actually gonna sound pretty good for this song. Turn that boost down a bit. And of course we can cut to all the way to negative 9 dB. And our high filter goes between 3 kilohertz and 24 kilohertz. So much bigger range than the SSL as well. You can really boost like almost all of the high mids and mids with this, or cut them if you want to. Let's turn that up, maybe a plus 3 dB. So we can hear we're getting a really kind of almost too sharp kind of like sizzle and kind of a little bit of harshness with that. So I'll turn that up somewhere a little bit more reasonable, maybe like 10K. And I'm actually going to turn that boost down a touch. It sounds kind of nice. And of course, you can cut 9 dB, add plus 9 dB. Turn that boost down a little bit. Now, let's bring in our compressor. Compressor is a little bit different than the SSL model. We've got a threshold over here, which we can turn down. This, you'll notice, is only measured in negative dB. So as I turn the threshold down negative 13 or so, we're actually starting to see some gain reduction going on there. Right? We have a release control over here that has a fast release time of 100 milliseconds, which even for, you know, a mastering compressor, fairly slow, I would say, for the minimum release, but for mastering, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the slowest release time is all the way at 1550 milliseconds, so even more than 1.5 seconds of release. Pretty nice range there, if you ask me. I'm going to set that to something a little more reasonable, maybe like, I don't know, 300 milliseconds or something. It's probably good. We also have a blend control right here, so we can actually do parallel compression with this, which is kind of nice. So you can blend in the uncompressed signal with the compressed signal and get some nice kind of like New York style parallel compression in there. I'll turn that back up to 100%. We have a makeup gain over here, which we can turn up all the way to something ridiculous, which I'm not going to do, but I'll turn up some makeup gain, maybe like, you know, 2 or 3 dB. And also on this one, the sidechain high pass filter is the sort of most obvious control compared to the really kind of hidden little trim pot over there for the SSL. And of course you can turn this all the way up to 350 Hertz. So it'll basically exclude anything below that from the detection circuit of the compressor. Let's listen to that. So now we're kind of like barely getting any gain reduction because it's only reacting to like kind of that snare and the hi-hats. As we turn this down, we get more of the kind of like top end of the kick drum. As we turn this down even further, we're actually kind of getting the full kick drum kind of detected in here. And then you'll notice that we don't have a ratio control other than this button right here that just says high ratio. So this is actually just going to switch between a ratio of 2:1 and a ratio of 5:1. And you'll notice that there's a pretty big difference between those two in this compressor model. So the 5:1, you'll notice the gain reduction has gone way, 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 way down over there. But at the lower ratio, it's a little bit less sort of like intense, a little bit less extreme of compression, I would say. And then finally, let's kick in the stereo imager. This stereo imager is a little bit different. It doesn't have that, I guess, space control where it was doing kind of an EQ boost. This one just sort of has a high pass filter, so we can turn the high pass filter on the width up to about 800 Hertz, which I actually kind of like bringing it all the way up there because I don't think the things that below that necessarily need to be widened. And then we also can't actually reduce the width down to mono like we can with the SSL model, but we can add width with this dial. And you'll notice that this really starts to kind of boost our sidebands a bit. And I think it's kind of a pleasant, honestly, even when the width is all the way up at maximum, especially with this high pass filter all the way up at maximum, it's still kind of a nice kind of like stereo widening. It might be a little too extreme for some uses, but if we turn that high pass filter down, now you'll notice that we've made everything too wide and it's just kind of this making the mix kind of fall apart. So if we turn that back up, maybe reduce the width by a bit down to like 7.4 or something, 7.0. I think that sounds pretty good. And then of course we have our output stage, which we can do a final boost or cut of the volume depending on what we've done in the plugin and where we want to get our levels to. Yeah, cool. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show y'all a couple of different mastering settings that I've dialed in with this plugin. One of them is, of course, using only the Neve models. One of them is using only the SSL models. And then the last one is going to be using a hybrid of all three. So let's go ahead and open it up. And here is our all Neve mastering chain, and here's how this sounds. So you'll notice I'm adding a bit of both dark and red saturation here. I've got my high pass filter and I've got my input gain turned up a bit over there. CNR drive is not on. Equalizer, I've reduced this to about 95 Hertz and this to about 9.5 kilohertz. I'm doing a bit of a boost in both the high and the lows just to give that kind of like smiley face EQ. Compressor, I'm using the regular 2:1 ratio. Release time, around 300 about. And then I've turned my threshold down a bit. I'm not using the sidechain high pass because I do want to kind of like level everything before I get to the final limiter with this. So I don't really want those super, super loud like kick transients to come in too much. And then stereo imager, I've turned that high pass filter all the way up, and I actually haven't widened it too much. I've only gone plus 3.24 in there. And I've set the output to be just 0 dB. All right, cool. Now let's move over to using only the SSL, and you'll notice we got a pretty big difference in sound here. You'll notice it sounds honestly a little too crunchy still, right? So I've added just a tiniest bit of saturation and drive, but I've noticed that even with the drive off on the SSL model, we're still getting a lot of like crunch here, right? It sounds like really kind of like almost a little bit too smashed, and I think it might actually have something to do with the G comp over here, the compressor. So I'm gonna go ahead and change my ratio to 2:1. Let's see how that sounds a bit. And of course, we've gotten to kind of like a quieter part, but I have found that just in general, like the dynamics processing and the saturation of the SSL, they add this really like kind of like, it's, you know, a pleasing style of distortion for sure, but it almost feels like it's just too much sometimes. It almost feels like there's too many new harmonics being added and just sort of like too much, especially for sort of a master chain for this style of music, I would say. I think that if you're making a style of music that doesn't require or would require more saturation, especially if you're using more kind of like, you know, acoustic instruments, if you're using more people's vocals and stuff, kind of making sort of a more kind of classic style of record, something that sounds vintage, I think that this SSL, all of these models are going to sound really, really good on that, and they're going to add that kind of saturation and that kind of like nice warmth and wit, you know, that you would want. But on this sort of like modern electronic song that I'm playing here, I think that it's just a little bit too much. Now, I'm going to go ahead and play y'all my hybrid mastering shade that I've made using models from both of these. So you'll notice, I think this master chain kind of sounds the best. I'm using the saturation, of course, from the Neve. I'm using the EQ from the SSL. I think the kind of limitations of the SSL EQ kind of make it so that the kind of pocket of these high and low filters sit a little bit better for a mastering chain. They don't let you kind of like go beyond what you need. And of course, I'm also using the compressor on the SSL too. And I'm using it in a 4:1, but I've got my release time a little bit shorter. I've got my attack time at 10 milliseconds. Threshold is up a bit, so it's not kind of squashing things too much over here. And no muck gain there either. And then of course I'm using the stereo imager from the Neve model, sorry. And adding just a bit of width there, turning that high pass filter up just to get a little bit of width and kind of like the higher mids and like high end and stuff. And the other thing is, I'm going to go ahead and switch between the Neve here, and I'm actually going to try to, because you have to manually match settings, I'm going to try to manually match these settings. So it's 7.55, and I don't actually have the ability to type that in, so I'm going to try to dial that in as best as I can. That's just almost exactly the same, right? And so you'll notice that when I switch between these, I don't hear a huge amount of difference between these two. Of course, I need to change the high pass filter as well. Forgot about that part. Just to about 20 kilohertz. This is as close as I can get to it. Yeah. And so I find that as far as using the plugin as kind of a master bus processor goes, it is really great. It sounds super awesome. I have a couple of things that I would be a little bit critical of this plugin. Thing number one, I think that because the input and output section are almost exactly the same, I think it would be probably beneficial for people to just quickly A/B things using the switch so that these, basically to make it so that these dials were kind of gain matched. I do see that obviously they have different ranges because I'm at 7.55 about for both of these, and you'll notice that I've turned the input dial on the Neve up a lot higher than it looks like it's on the SSL model. So obviously that might complicate things a little bit, but I feel like having that kind of just gain matching built in so you can kind of quickly A/B those two things at least wouldn't be too complicated. Other thing that I'd like to note about the plugin is if we take a look down here in my Ableton device view, there's just this headroom control right here. And I'm not 100% sure what the headroom control does. As we can kind of see in here, it sort of changes the character just a bit, but I'm not really hearing too much difference. And the reason why I'm kind of iffy about this is the only automatable parameter so far. Obviously, this is a beta version of the plugin, so there could be an update to that in the official release. It could be that you can automate every single one of these controls. But for somebody like me who likes to create, big macro devices in Ableton and give myself kind of like actual automation control over my plugins, that's something that is a little bit of, I'm missing that essentially, right? Other than that, I really, really like the sound of this plugin, and I actually think that it's going to make it on the master bus of a lot of my projects going forward. I think it's personally a really good emulation of both of these. I haven't technically used the hardware version of either of these, although I do own an SSL Ultraviolet EQ, which is their 500 series module version of their EQ. It has a little bit more features, but it has the same, I think, low shelving and high shelving filters built into it. And those, in my opinion, sound pretty close to each other. I really enjoyed trying out NFuse. I think it's a great sounding mastering processor, and I can't wait to use it on more projects in the future. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the like button, and if you aren't subscribed to Pyramind yet, it's just a click away. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see y'all next time.